Hi, this is Carrie with Carrie Concealed in the Active Self-Protection Extra channel, and this is part 2 of our You Have the Right to Remain Silent versus You Have the Ability to Remain Silent.
Today's video is brought to us by Mantis. The Mantis family of products is integral to ASP staff building handgun and carbine skills and are your most economical and fastest path to improvement in your skills too. Whether you choose the X10, the Laser Academy, the Blackbeard, or use them all in concert, they will help your practice be more effective, efficient, and fun. Go check them out, pick up a unit, and thank them for sponsoring today's video.
When in part 1, we talked about oftentimes folks will have a plan, not oftentimes, some folks will have a plan for what they will talk to law enforcement or detectives about or investigators about after a critical incident, if they, God forbid, are involved in one. And often it's something along the lines of, I'm happy to visit with you after I've had a chance to speak with my attorney. And yet, in my experience and with the expert witness work I do and the expert witness work a lot of my colleagues do, even folks that have that plan will often not follow that plan. They'll often choose to talk to the investigators within less than an hour, sometimes 2 hours of the incident happening. We talked about that. Why does that happen? And a Dave Spalding quote: he says that you have the right to remain silent, but you don't always have the ability to do so. And then we talked about this book by James Duane about you have the right to remain innocent. And we talked about that big divide between saying a big gap between saying something like, we also talked about logorrhea, which is that desire to, loquacious is the only word I can think of, I won't use that one, to talk a whole bunch, especially after a critical incident. We're often trying to, get back to a normal state, so maybe getting rid of the excess adrenaline in us, but we also have this deep-seated desire to answer the questions and to satisfy the person asking us the questions. And we want to explain our reason for why we did what we did. We want people to understand why we chose to use lethal force. And so there's that gap between what am I going to say? What if I choose to say, please, I'll talk with you or I'll give you a full statement after I've talked to my attorney. There's an uncomfortable silence that then follows that. And what are we going to do during that? That's often what I see on the interrogation files or interview files, videos, that long silence is when minds are changed. But it's our humanness is what can make that really difficult. So one of the things, in my experience, the training that I have taken, oftentimes it's the police officer that's teaching on the side or the active military person that's teaching on the side. They're often the ones that I have heard say, make sure you give a statement to police, be honest and tell them everything you know, because that way they're better able to help you, they're better able to protect you. And often those same folks will say, well, if you're justified in using force, you have nothing to worry about because what you tell the police officer it won't hurt you since you were justified in your use of force. And so anyway, whether you agree with that or not, that is up to you. I've certainly seen it go both ways. Most often it hasn't gone that way. Often those statements that are made after the fact can be really confusing. We're going to talk about why that is in just a minute. But first, I was kind of curious how many formal law enforcement training programs discuss the aftermath of a lethal force encounter and how many even just discuss self-defense. And so there's a study, and it's not a great one, but it was done in 2017. And the title of it is Firearms Training, What is Actually Taught? So one thing that often makes me think of this is years ago, I saw a Pew study or something where they asked people what was the primary reason for them wanting to purchase a gun. And the 2023 Pew study said that 72% of U.S. gun owners say protection is the major reason. 81% of respondents said they feel safer owning a gun. Other surveys put it at closer to 86 to 92%. As the reason they own a gun is for self-protection. So whatever the reason is, just think it's interesting that I was going to tell you the results of this already. My goodness, I'm getting ahead of myself. So this study found they surveyed 20 firearm trainers in the New England states, and these researchers actually attended the classes, and they kept tallies of the different topics they talked about. And their study found that just over half of the instructors mentioned the legal ramifications of using a gun in self-defense. 9 of 20 instructors recommended using guns only as a last resort. It's only 9, less than half. 8 of the 20 discussed additional options for self-defense, such as alarms, dogs, OC, that sort of thing. So we can do better. I know we can definitely do better than that, that's for sure. So I mentioned just a minute ago that in my experience, it's often those that are active in law enforcement that will teach their students that you should give a full, robust statement. You've got nothing to hide. And, don't worry about talking to your attorney first, those sorts of things. The informed police officers that I'm familiar with, the ones that are informed, don't usually say that. They understand. Now, I'm not talking about they don't say that if they're the detective on that case. I'm saying if they're telling people about it outside of their job. And one example would be Sheriff Hunter. He was one of the Force Science facilitators in our Advanced Force Science course. And he deeply, deeply understands the human factors that are involved when force is used. Usually when we're using force, it's in the midst of split-second decisions, tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving circumstances, and under the consequences of life and death, often dealing with an ambiguously armed subject. And Sheriff Nick said, as an expert, he'd rather have his police officers say, I don't know, if they don't know. Not saying they should lie or anything. If they truly don't know, it's best if we say, I don't know. And the reason for that is because there are memory errors that can happen. Part of it is the brain is trying to make sense of what happened to it, and so it will just start filling in the gaps with what it think happened, even if that's not actually what happened. And so one type of memory error is confabulation, and that's a false or a distorted memory without even realizing that it's false or distorted, without realizing it's incorrect. And then another thing that can happen, he's talking about officer-involved shootings. It's similar for private citizens as well. Another thing is during an interview process, the person being interviewed can experience cognitive dissonance, and they can become agreeable to information that they couldn't even possibly have known within the circumstances of the event. And that's really confusing. It's really hard for police officers especially, but private citizens also, to say, I don't know, especially after you've had to use force to protect yourself or protect someone else. Because we feel like we should know, and we often feel like we should have the answers for things. Sheriff Nick explained to us as a group, saying I don't know if you don't know, if you genuinely don't know, is much easier than having to bring in an expert and have them try to explain after the fact the human factors of attention, memory formation under stress, etc., to be able to explain why that officer's or that defender's statement is a false statement and not a lie. There's a very, very big difference between a false statement and a lie. And often these experts' understanding of human performance factors, memory, perception, focus of attention, that informs their opinion on the topic. And one of the things that I don't know if a lot of people know, back in, I can't remember what year it was, when the Darren Wilson, the police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, I believe it was, I was curious what statements police officers are required to give after an officer-involved shooting and how that compares to what private citizens do. And I did a little bit of research and found that immediately following an officer-involved shooting, typically the police officer, the agency or department will have a policy of dealing with this, and typically they're only allowed to give, that police officer was only allowed to give a public safety statement. And what's a public safety statement? Well, it goes something like this, and I'm not going to say which agency this is from, but they're remarkably similar across agencies, I found, at least. So I didn't, of course, investigate all of them, but a number of them. So the supervisor will say something like, at this time, and to the best of your knowledge, answer these questions. And there's typically just 2 or 3 questions. Where were you standing, or in what direction were you firing rounds? In what direction did the suspect fire rounds? So notice it's in what direction did you shoot? In what direction was the suspect shooting? And if you injured anyone, what is their location? And so that's a public safety statement. So the emphasis is on the police officer making that statement to the best of their knowledge. And I think it's wonderful that the department is careful to explain that, because they are making it to the best of their knowledge. Once that officer's had 2 to 3 sleep cycles, then they will have a typical, usually a cognitive interview, hopefully a cognitive interview by someone specially trained in that process. And their attorney will be there, or a union rep or a union attorney, or all of them. And then they're going through that typical interview. So most lawyers I know of and I've worked with say something like along the lines of what Don West, who was he's National Trial Counsel for CCW Safe, and he also was lead counsel with Mark Hamill on a Florida trial, very well known and publicized Florida trial from a number of years ago, and you can look that up. He says, quote, "If you give a statement to be cooperative, often you will say things that will form the prosecution's case that you lied, when in actuality you didn't." So it's just interesting to me that attorneys typically say one thing, informed police officers that understand human factors and the different things that can happen to us during memory formation and critical incidents, they often have different answers. Often, so Masada Ayub at my Deadly Force instructor course and MAG 40, we mentioned that in part 1 also. If you haven't done MAG 40, please do it as soon as you can, or MAG 20, at least get that information from him. You'll regret it someday, I think, if you don't. And Mr. Moss has a 5-point checklist. The first thing is he says, establish the active dynamic. That's just saying this person tried to do that to me, very briefly. And then number 2, often, I know USCCA has a checklist, that sort of thing. So anyway, whichever one you want to use, but they have similar topics. Make a statement that you'll sign a complaint. I've talked to a number of folks recently, within the past 2 years, that are active law enforcement, and that typically isn't something that people will do, or they even have the option to do that in the aftermath. It's kind of I wouldn't say antiquated, but different terminology is used in different departments. And so, and the ones I've spoken with, it's just not a common procedure done in a situation like that. So that might think of something else, I guess. And then pointing out evidence or pointing out witnesses, that it's very likely that you may not be aware of witnesses or of where evidence is, or what you think might be evidence or what you think might have been a witness actually isn't. And so that's a decision you'll have to make. Most likely the police officers will be there and doing a nice job investigating. So let's wrap this up. The lawyers and the informed law enforcement professionals and the human factors experts and researchers, they know a lot more about what happens to the brain and the mind and the human during and after a critical incident. I encourage my learners to find out as much as they can about that, so that they can make an informed decision and they can know their why regarding any statement they're going to make, post-interview statement they're going to make. So if I'm going to say, I'd be happy to talk to you after I've had a chance to talk to my attorney, I want to know my why for making that statement. I don't want it just to be, well, because I heard it was a good idea, or I heard it was the best thing to say. No, I want to be insanely curious about understanding, so why do they say that's a good idea? Is that a good idea for me? In what circumstances? Or is something else better? But I think if we have a solid understanding of our why, our reason for what we plan to do, then it's easier to stick with our decision, or to evaluate whether or not we should stick with it in that circumstance. So if we decide to tell them everything that happened, if you're someone that is in that camp, and that's your decision too. I'm not saying one's better than the other, or I know what's better for me, I feel like, but I'm not going to make that decision for you. My job isn't to tell you what to do. We're just talking about these topics to be thinking about and exploring them. But if we're one of those types that decides I am going to tell them everything to the best of my ability, we want to make sure that we have a plan to stop talking also. Because what I've seen, what I find is once an individual starts talking, those interviews can go on for 4, 5, 6, 7 hours nonstop, and go into areas that the individual never intended for them to go into. And they're guessing, and they're saying, well, I guess, or I don't. Even if they say, I don't know, oftentimes the interviewer will say, well, tell me what you do know, or what do you think happened? And like we said when we were talking about this book, is that the author says that oftentimes those statements that help you, that are made to police during your interview, are most likely never going to be heard by a jury. So what you tell police, with extremely rare exceptions, will never be revealed to the jury at your trial unless it's offered by the prosecutor and is used to help get you convicted. Nothing you tell the police will be of any value to your lawyer at your trial, and that's usually because of hearsay rules. And you can look into that some more if you want to. So in my experience, once somebody starts talking, it's very difficult for them to choose to stop on their own. They feel compelled to continue talking. So if we're going to do that, we want to have a plan to stop doing that. Maybe get comfortable with pregnant pauses or silence. That's something I'm still working on. So let's wrap this up. I encourage people, always carry your OC spray, get an inert unit, and practice that. You can order those from Palm, and practice deploying it. It's important that we know how to get it out of our pocket quickly and be able to use it effectively. And then as part of your aftermath plan, let's hope we never ever have to use our aftermath plan, but I hope that firearm legal protection is part of your plan. Great people at FLP there. And then educate yourself about human factors in critical incidents so we can have, and when I say educate yourself, I'm talking to me. I need to further and continue to deeply investigate these human factor principles so that I can have the best informed decision about whether or not to interview with counsel or without counsel, if God forbid I'm involved in a critical incident. So thanks for being here today. I hope this has been helpful, and we look forward to seeing you next week.